Luke chapter 11, as we continue to look at the Gospel of Luke, and mainly just the emphasis that he had on these different meals that Jesus ate with people. Meals that Jesus ate with people. And today he's going to be in the home of another Pharisee. In another Pharisee's home. And so I was trying to think what the emphasis was. The only thing I could really think of was this is going to be a very, very difficult conversation he has. And so it's impolite table conversation. Here you are invited over to someone's house to eat, and the dinner conversation kind of takes a different turn, and not very nice when Jesus starts to address the Pharisees and the other rulers that were around him. So that's what I want us to look at this morning. To begin, I want to share with you just kind of as illustration, not a story, but a theory that a particular sociologist has. And this sociologist, he's passed away now, but his name was Charles Horton Cooley. And Charles Horton Cooley developed this idea of where self comes from, or where our personality comes from. And he referred to it as the looking glass self. Now basically what he said was, without our relationships with one another, without interactions with other people, then we have no personality. We have no sense of self. Everything, we're not born with any type of personality or sense of self. It all comes from society. It's all socially driven. And he called this a looking glass self. And basically here's how it worked. The looking glass is an old-fashioned word for mirror. Now, the reason I know that is because my grandmother on my mom's side, Nanny, she was old. My whole life, she was old. And I remember her once in a while saying, "Has anybody seen my looking glass?" or referring to a little compact mirror as a looking glass. In my mind, a looking glass would be more of something you look through, but it means a mirror. And so what Charles Horton Cooley says is that our sense of self comes from other people. Other people are a mirror reflecting back on us. And so basically here's what it is. The way I see myself, and so my self-image, my sense of self, my personality, the way I see myself is a reflection of how I think you see me. And so you are a mirror, and when I look out at you, it reflects back. And so the way I see myself is how I think, and that's the key word, think, because I don't really know. But the way I see myself is how I think that you see me. And so if I think you see me as somebody who's competent, who is somewhat entertaining, who is somewhat good looking, when Roxy called me over to her table today and said that I lost a lot of weight, all of a sudden I see myself, look at this. I kind of see myself that way. Now, on the other hand, however, if somebody says, which is this happens to me a lot, some of my friends around here, Pastor Chris Whitney and some other of my pastor friends, who are little bitty people, they'll call me Big Kevin or Big Kev. And of course, the moment they say that, then I see myself as this giant. And so the way I see myself is really a reflection. Now this morning when you got dressed, when you put on your clothes, you weren't really thinking, does this look good on me? What you were thinking is, will other people think this looks good on me? And if you think other people think it looks good on you, then you feel good about yourself. But if you don't, then, this is why that one bump on your face can ruin your whole day. You see that and you think the very first thing people are going to see is that bump. Or you can be full of confidence and then you walk into a room and you trip and you fall and people laugh. Well, then in that moment in time, you think other people see you as clumsy, and so you start becoming clumsy, right? It's all what other people think. And here's the point of that story, and I hope I can remember to come back to it at the end. But we spend an incredible amount of time wondering what other people think of us. And in reality, they're not thinking of us at all because they're wondering what people think of them. But we spend an incredible amount of time wondering what other people think of us and how other people see us, instead of wondering how God sees us, or trying to live a life in such a way that is pleasing to Him. We're so focused on the people around us and what they're thinking and our perceptions of that. And so regardless if you disagree or agree with Charles Horton Cooley, that main idea that we spend an inordinate amount of time worried or thinking about what other people think of us is really hard to escape. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this particular story. In Luke chapter 11, verse 37 is where the story begins. Luke chapter 11, verse 37. Luke writes, "Now when Jesus had finished speaking," and so if you go back to the beginning of the chapter, you can see some of the things that he had said. For example, in Luke chapter 11, at the very beginning of the chapter, is a shorter version of the Lord's Prayer. It's Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer, where the disciples say, "Teach us how to pray," and then Jesus gives this model prayer. And so he teaches about prayer. Then beginning in verse 14, he is casting out a demon from someone. And as he's casting out this demon, people start to question him and thinking, hey, he must be a demon himself if he's able to cast out a demon. And so he uses that familiar quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." If he was from Satan, then he wouldn't be able to cast out Satan, in other words. And so Jesus was just continuing his ministry. And the more he did his ministry, then the more people would start to criticize him, at least from the religious establishment. And so here he is doing that. And then in verse 29, he starts to give the sign of Jonah about what's going to happen really at the end of time. And then in verse 33, he starts to give this story about light and darkness. And really that's the story that goes into the context of this meal with the Pharisee. He's talking about light and darkness. And what we're going to see is now he's going to make an accusation that the Pharisees, who thought they were walking in light because they rejected him as the Messiah, they were really walking in darkness. And so they were one thing when they thought they were one thing when in reality they were another thing. And the Pharisees were all about their outward appearance and what other people thought of them. The looking glass self. And so verse 37 says, "When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table." Now that phrase, "recline at the table," again, means two things. First, this is how they sat. They would be reclining with their feet out behind them. But the fact now that Luke points out that he's reclining at the table means this is another one of those big meals. Last week when he ate with Martha and Mary, that was more of a private meal. But now the Pharisee's inviting Jesus to his house, which means he's also going to invite a lot of other important people. And they're all going to be around, probably eating outside the house in the courtyard area. And then the community would be around them watching them eat. And some of the poor people would be in the community, the beggars, just hoping that they would get some of the scraps from the table. And so this was a huge kind of public event. So Jesus is reclining at the table. Well, look at verse 38. "But the Pharisee noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal," or noticing that he did not first wash before the meal, was surprised. Jesus didn't wash his hands. And the Pharisee found this offensive. Now, in reality, there's more going on here than sanitation. More than likely, when Jesus entered the home, following the custom of the day, when he entered the home, he would have washed his hands, and the servants would have come and washed his feet because they, walked around in sandals. And so the customary greeting, especially with someone important, is that as soon as he entered the house, there would be something to wash his hands with. And so more than likely, Jesus washed his hands with that, and then somebody would wash his feet to get the dust off the feet. But then, if you were a rabbi, if you thought that you were a very pious person, which the Pharisees would have thought about themselves, then before the meal, you would go through another ritual washing of your hands. And this particular washing had become very ritualistic, and it was an outward sign that you were pious. And only the pious and the religious people would do this ritual washing. Not the customary washing of your hands for sanitation, but this ritual washing that has some type of religious significance. And so here is Jesus, who people were claiming was a rabbi. Other people were claiming that he was the Messiah. People thought that he was this particular person. And the Pharisee, who saw himself as a person like that, was offended when this person, who was supposed to be an example for others, did not go through this ritualistic washing of his hands. It would be similar today to someone if I was out in a public place eating. And then all of a sudden somebody would come to you and say, "Isn't Kevin your pastor?" "Yeah." Well, the other day I saw him at McDonald's, and he didn't pray before he ate. You see, that's really what he was talking about. This ritualistic was like praying before a meal. And so now here's, I can't believe you didn't pray before you ate. And so the Pharisees and the teachers of the law apparently were talking about this among themselves. There was murmuring going on around the table. Did you see that? Jesus didn't wash his hands. Did you see that? Jesus didn't pray. Who does he think he thought? Look at this. And apparently Jesus overheard them. And so in verse 39, Luke says, "And then the Lord said to him, 'Now then, you Pharisees, clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people.'" Now, how many of you would go to somebody's house who's invited you for a meal, and then, the dinner conversation, you call them wicked, judgmental fools? You say, man, you've lost your manners. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But give what is inside the dish to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. And then it gets worse. But I want to stop here and go ahead and kind of make the emphasis, because what Jesus is now going to point out is the hypocrisy in the lives of the Pharisees. And here he is saying, you Pharisees, you're like this dish. You clean the outside of it, but you don't clean the inside of it. You're all about the outward appearances, but inside you are still evil. You are still wicked. You clean the outside. And so, look, oftentimes there's a lot of us who are religious people who are like that. On the outside, we look like we got it all together, but on the inside, we haven't even allowed the Holy Spirit to start cleaning us up. And so that's the heart of what Jesus was getting at. And so what I want to do is to try to put a little bit more positive spin on this by asking ourselves the question, where did it go? We'll do it this way. By asking ourselves the question, what is true discipleship? What is genuine discipleship? Because the opposite of hypocrisy then would be the genuineness that we have. And so as he's looking at, or as Jesus is going to be condemning the Pharisees because of their hypocrisy, then I want us to turn around and talk about what is genuine discipleship. What are some signs or some marks of a person who is truly following Christ? All right? Is it coming back up? We'll see. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. We'll just go from there. Now you got to find it again. All right. Love it when a plan comes together from that. Signs of genuine discipleship. Now, the first one, to get us started, I've already mentioned very, very quickly, but the first one in verse 41 is generosity. Because Jesus says, you've done this, but in actuality, what you need to be doing is giving what's inside, giving the best part of the meal, so to speak, to the poor. Now, when he said this, there would be poor people around watching this whole event unfold. Give to the poor. Generosity is a sign of a genuine disciple. The word miser and the word misery are closely related. And a person who has been saved and redeemed and sanctified by the blood of Christ cannot continue to be a selfish person. God has given to you freely. Now we are to give to others freely. And so generosity. Now Jesus moves on in this impolite conversation. He's going to mention 6 woes. 6, woe to you. This is a big deal. Woe. These are 6 judgmental kind of statements that he's going to make to the Pharisees. And so look what he says. Again, in verse 41, he says, but give what is inside the dish to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Verse 42. Woe to you, Pharisees! because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. So there's 2 marks right there. He said, look, you Pharisees, you're giving 10%, you're tithing. Outwardly you look like you got it all together, but you're neglecting justice and love of God. And so sign number 2 would be justice, and sign number 3 would be love of God. A follower of Jesus Christ stands up for justice. Now this is in the context again of Jesus just saying you should be given to the poor. And so when you look around and you see the poor people around you, or you see the people who are vulnerable and the disenfranchised. I've been doing a lot of thinking about justice lately, and in the Old Testament there are 4 groups of people that the Bible mentions are disenfranchised, or the vulnerable outside of society, and that followers of God are supposed to pay special attention to make sure that these people are not overlooked and that justice is done for them. And the 4 groups of people are widows, orphans, immigrants. Doesn't matter if they're legal or illegal. It just says immigrants. Man, as a follower of Jesus Christ, God is concerned with how we treat the strangers in our land, regardless of why they're here or how they got here. The immigrant. And then the 4th category is the poor. The poor. And so here's Jesus. Look, you Pharisees, you look like you got it all together outwardly. You're giving 10% of everything that you earn, but you're not standing up for justice. And you're not loving God. A true believer will be generous, stand up for justice, and love God. But then notice what he says, the very end of verse 42. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. And so just in case you're thinking, oh, Jesus is saying I don't have to tithe, I don't have to do any of these rituals. All I got to do is love God and help the poor, and I'm okay. Jesus says, no, you're misunderstood. You need to do them both. You need to do the religious rituals, still do the tithing, but don't forsake the other parts of Scripture. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. And then verse 43, he says it again. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogue and greetings in the marketplace. You know, again, some of this is cultural, but in that day and time, the chief seats or the most important seats in a public event, even the synagogue, would be the ones up front. If somebody invites you to their house, then you want to be seated at the place of honor. Now, James, Jesus' brother, talks about this in his letter, the book of James, about how when you enter a place, seek the lowly position, and then let the homeowner come and tell you, come up here and sit with me. But the Pharisees, they wanted that first place. They wanted to be in the front. They wanted everybody to see them. They loved to have that attention. But yet inside, they didn't have it all together. And so the 4th sign of a genuine disciple is humility. Humility. A true follower of Christ strives to be humble. But humility is kind of tricky, isn't it? I mean, the more humble you try to be, and you want everybody to see how humble you are, and then you've forgotten what humility is all about. You know. Humility. I want people to notice my humility. Well, you still got some things to learn. Humility. Love. Justice. Generosity. Look at verse 44. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves which men walk over without knowing it. Now what is that? Well, again, in the book of the law, if a person touched a dead body, then they were unclean for so many days. That became to be interpreted if a person walked over a grave. If there was a dead body in the grave, well then if a person walked over the grave, now they were unclean by walking over that grave because there was a dead body underneath it. Now, then a person could walk over an unmarked grave, wouldn't know they were walking over an unmarked grave, and by the law would be therefore unclean. But they wouldn't know it. They would think they were okay. And so here is Jesus saying, the problem with you Pharisees is you think that you're clean. But in reality, you're unclean. You think that all of your religious practices have made you right with God, but in reality, because your heart is not right with God, well then you're just as unclean as a person who's walked over a grave. And so, the fifth sign of a genuine believer is just simply integrity. Integrity. You're actually living out what you believe. It's coming from the heart. It's not just a show, but this is who you really are. It's an integration. Integrity. And then look at verse 45. One of the experts in the law answered him. Now the expert could have been another Pharisee, or it could have just been a lawyer. One of the experts in the law, and they're talking about the Mosaic law, the Old Testament. One of the experts of the law answered him, "Teacher, you know when you say these things to us, you're insulting us." Duh. Jesus, you're an invited guest into this house, and you're insulting us. And then look what he says, verse 46. Jesus replied, "And you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them." I think Jesus was kind of saying, you thought I insulted you before. Just wait. You have loaded people down with burdens. Now, don't raise your hand, but have you ever been involved in some type of religion or some type of church, and not to criticize other forms of play, but it was so difficult to please the people in that church. They had so many requirements on you. They just loaded you down. And following Christ was more of a burden than a blessing. You see, that's the bad side of religion. We load each other down with these rules and regulations, and without realizing what we're doing, and we just burden people down. Now, to turn that around positive, a sixth sign then of a genuine disciple is encouragement. Instead of encouraging other people in their walk following God, the Pharisees were just discouraging people, loading them down with unnecessary burdens. Now here, the Pharisees thinking that they're the ones who are bringing people to God, and Jesus is saying, look, you're doing the opposite, and he'll come back to that in just a second. And so encouragement. And then verse 47, woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your forefathers who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your forefathers did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Because of this, God in His wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill, and others they will persecute. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. Now, I don't know if I can explain all of that. But here are the Pharisees who thought they were the keepers of the law and that they had honored the prophets, when in reality Jesus was saying, your forefathers had killed all the prophets. And they killed the prophets, and then you build these monuments and worship them, when you're just as guilty as killing them as they are. And now, and I think here's what he's getting at. And now he says, this generation is going to be held responsible for all of those prophets who were killed. I think this is what he was saying. Jesus was saying, look, You've done exactly what your forefathers have done. Except now you are rejecting me, the Messiah. All of the prophets pointed to the Messiah, and they had been killed, many of them had, by the forefathers of the Pharisees, and now the Pharisees are rejecting Jesus. And so Jesus is saying, in essence, he's prophesying, you're going to be held responsible for all of that because you're rejecting the Messiah. You know, this may not be a good illustration, but this is the only thing I could think of as I was reading over this, mainly again this morning. In Franklin, all over town, you know, we have these monuments to the Civil War, don't we? And if you look at them real closely, all those monuments are in honor of the Confederacy. They're not in honor of the Union. We're honoring the ones who were on the wrong side of history. Apparently, that's kind of what they were doing. You built these monuments for the prophet when you're responsible for killing the prophets. And now you're rejecting me. Here, I think, is the positive point from this. The seventh sign of a genuine disciple is obedience. Obedience. The forefathers had disobeyed the prophets, and now the Pharisees were being disobedient to the Messiah. Obedience. When we disobey God, we are once again crucifying Jesus. You know, we're saying his sacrifice was no good. Oh, we'll build a monument of a church and go worship. But we're guilty unless we're completely obedient. And then, verse 52. He says, woe to you experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who are entering. You Pharisees, you've taken away the key to... You were supposed to be pointing people to the Messiah, but instead, you haven't even accepted it, and you stood in the way, and you've hindered other people from coming to Christ. Now, here's the eighth sign of a disciple. Witnessing. Everything I do in my life should point to Jesus. Now, I don't always live up to that, but everything that I do in my life should point to Jesus. And every opportunity I have, when I come into contact with people, somehow or another, through my contact with other people, I am supposed to be moving them closer to Christ. That may mean that I get the opportunity to tell them about Jesus. It may mean that I don't. But how I rub shoulders with them, how I run into them, somehow or another, I'm supposed to leave them with a positive experience of Jesus. The worst thing in the world that I think could ever happen, and even though people are personally responsible, and I'm not downplaying that, but the worst thing that could ever happen is if somebody were to say, you know what, I would have followed Jesus if it wasn't for Kevin. I would follow Jesus, but you know what? My only experience with a Christian is that guy. And because of that guy, there's no way I'm going to turn to Christ. And that's what Jesus said the Pharisees were doing. Instead of being this witness for him, they were actually standing in the way and preventing other people from following. 8 marks of a genuine disciple. This is how we should see ourselves. Not how other people see us, but how this. Now, the rest of that story or that theory of Charles Horton Cooley, the way I see myself is a reflection of how I think other people see me. He goes on to say that everybody has in their life what he calls the significant other or others. It's not your lover. It's that one person or that small group of people that what you think they think of you is more important than what you think other people think of you. You following that? That's the significant other. And so we have that person, it could be a parent, it could be a spouse, it could just be a good friend, but you have that person that what you think they think of you far outweighs what other people think of you. Or it works this way. What other people think of you temporarily affects how you see yourself, but how you think that other person sees you brings it up. And here's an illustration. If I walked into this room full of confidence, it would be because I think, you think, I'm okay. If on the way up here I trip and I fall, all of a sudden I think, you think I'm clumsy. And so I'm clumsy for a little while. Has this ever happened to anybody? You fall and then you get up and you try to make a joke. Oh, first day on my new legs. And you try to deflect that. And then, as you're trying to get yourself back together, something else happens and you drop something else. Has this happened to anybody? And it just kind of compounds on each other. But over time, you kind of get yourself back together again. Well, the reason you get yourself back together is temporarily I'm seeing myself the way I think you see me. But ultimately, that significant other will kick in. And if I think that significant other sees me in a certain way, well, then I get myself back together and the confidence comes back. Now, here's the question. Who is the significant other in your life? Or let me ask it another way. Who should the significant other be in your life? Jesus. When I make Jesus Lord of my life, I see myself the way He sees me, which is forgiven, redeemed, sanctified, valuable, worth something. Then it doesn't matter what I think you think of me, but what He thinks of me. And then when I realize that when I see myself the way that I think He sees me, what's going to happen? I'm going to be more generous. I'm going to stand up for justice. I'm going to love God. I'm going to be humble. I'm going to be a person of integrity. I'm going to look around and encourage other people. I'm going to be obedient to what He asked me to do. And I'm going to be a witness for Him. If I don't do that, if I don't keep Jesus as that focus, well, then I could become a Pharisee. Do all these really neat stuff that other people look at and say, oh, what a great guy. But inside, I'm a dirty dish. I'm a dirty dish. I haven't really been cleaned. Is Jesus that significant other in your life? With every head bowed and every eye closed. In just a second, I want to close this in prayer. But before I do, I just want to encourage you just to spend some time in quiet prayer. And if Christ is not that significant person, you haven't asked Him to come to your life, well, then do that. But maybe you have asked Him to come to your life, but you know in your heart of hearts, you still look at what other people think of you. And you can be feeling good, but then you get that one phone call from that person and your whole day's ruined. You can be feeling good about yourself, and then that one person looks at you a certain way, and you know what it means, and your whole view of yourself just plummets because you're focused on the wrong thing. And then you try to do good, you give, you do all these things, but you know on the inside you're like the Pharisee. And this morning you just want to pray, Lord, I want You to be that significant person in my life. I want to see myself the way You see me. And Father, may my self-image, may my view of self come from You, not other people. And then, Lord, as I recognize that, then these 8 signs of a discipleship, of a true disciple, genuine, not hypocritical, but a genuine disciple. Lord, may I start putting these in my life. Help me to be generous and loving and just and obedient, humble, and a witness. Father, we love you today, and we thank you for your word and for your Spirit. I thank you for the opportunity we've had just to come together. And I pray, Lord, as we leave here, we will leave with confidence, knowing that you are our God and that you love us. It doesn't matter what other people think. We know that you love us and you value us and prize us. We'll give you the praise and the honor. In Jesus' name, amen. You're dismissed.